And then a couple, like 3 or 4 weeks into rehearsal, Adam Pascal and Michael Greif, the director, and I we had started to move onto the stage from the rehearsal room, and we were just starting to space out What You Own on the stage. And we were literally singing the lyric, "We're dying in America at the end of the millennium. And when you're dying in America at the end of the millennium, you're not alone." When there was this commotion in the back of the theater, and we sort of looked up and stopped, and the production manager came to the edge of the stage, and she was like, "Nothing to worry about. Jonathan just fainted in the back of the theater. He's going to be okay. He's just, he's been a little stressed out, we think. He's a little tired. We're going to take him to the hospital, but just, should be all right." I'm like, "That's weird." Like, okay. He was 35. It was probably stressful. It was an exciting time, but it was also a stressful time. So we sort of had that weird moment, and then we continued our work. And over the next couple of days, we got some updates that Jonathan had gone to the hospital, and they'd sent him away thinking, they pumped his stomach thinking that maybe it was food poisoning, because he'd been feeling sort of nauseous and weak and lightheaded and stuff. But then a couple of days later, we got the progress report that he still hadn't been feeling well. He'd gone to a different hospital, and they had sent him home with the diagnosis of flu-like symptoms. They'd done a chest X-ray because he had also this pain in his chest, but they didn't find anything. They thought he was being maybe a little bit hypochondriacal. So we were, continuing our work, and there wasn't a lot that he could have done anyway at that point because we were doing the technical rehearsals, and the text was pretty well set, at least at that point, as much as it could be until we had an audience. That's the way the process works is you get it done, just to get it up on its feet, and then once you have an audience, you can really start to see what's working, what isn't working, and then you can monkey with the text more. So it was okay that he wasn't there. It would have stressed me out anyway. So the dress rehearsal night came, and happily Jonathan was well enough to come to the theater that night, and we all, were quite excited, as you can imagine. And the dress rehearsal is the time when it's the first time you really get to do it for an audience. It's an audience of invited guests, friends and associates and colleagues and people from, people who have some sort of connection with the piece, or with the people involved in the piece. So we did our performance, and it was, for the first time especially, it was quite great. The audience went bananas, and the show played the way that it tends to play, which is when it plays well, it gets a huge response. And we were all really excited. I came out from backstage, and the theater is actually not much bigger than this room. And certainly the ceiling's lower, but it's a pretty intimate space. And I came out from behind the backstage, and I looked over here to this corner of the room, and there was Jonathan surrounded by people. And normally, when you see a show, if people are excited by it, if they're going to wait afterwards and talk to people, they tend to wait for the actors, because that's who they recognize. But the people in that audience made a point to find out who Jonathan was, because they wanted to thank him. They wanted to go up to him and tell him how much he had impacted them. So I was like, wow, that's pretty impressive. And I wanted to go up to myself and just give him a hug and say, fantastic. And there was a lot of stuff that I've been wanting to kind of store up to say to him about how grateful I was for everything that he'd done, and I've sort of been saving for that night. But he was really busy talking to people. I talked to a couple of my friends who had come that night who were really, literally, one of them was still shaking and tears in her eyes. And so I knew that, again, it was really working. And when I looked back, Jonathan was gone. I was like, oh no, where'd he go? It turned out that the New York Times had sent a writer to see the show that night. Not because they were going to review it, but because it happened that our production of Red was coinciding with the 100th anniversary of La La Land. So they're like, that's an interesting fact. Let's include this rock opera in a story about La La Land. It was essentially the idea. I think it was going to be like a little sidebar. Well, the writer who came, who happened to be like a classical music writer because he's opera writer, had been so moved by what he'd seen that he asked Jonathan to sit with him for an on-the-spot interview. And if you're involved in the arts, if you're a writer, an actor, a director, anybody involved in the arts, for better or for worse, the New York Times is a huge deal. That they can make or break your life. Literally. If you get a good review or a good write-up or a good interview in the New York Times, your life can change forever in that moment. So there were all these indications, the audience response, the people surrounding Jonathan, and this New York Times writer asking for a sit-down interview, that things were going to go his head against all these walls to get something happening for himself. That he was on the cusp of something quite special happening for him. So as I was leaving the theater, I looked in the box office window, and there he was talking to the New York Times writer, and I was like, maybe I'll knock on the door and just say goodnight. And I'm like, no, this is his moment. Let him have his moment. Big deal for him. I'll see him tomorrow. And went home, went to sleep, and the next morning I woke up, and as I was checking my messages, because, hoping that my friends who'd come might leave me even more cool messages, like, hey, great show. There was a very strange message on my voicemail from the artistic director of the New York Theater Workshop, just saying, please call, like in this really dead voice. I was like, that's weird. That doesn't sound good. But, was somebody fired? Are we going to cancel the performance tonight? Was there technical difficulty? Did the theater burn down or something? And as I was getting ready to call him back, my agent, who happened to work with Jonathan's agent, called. The phone rang, and it was my agent, Sarah, and she said the sentence that I never imagined I would ever hear, which was that Jonathan died last night. Which was a stunning thing to hear. As I said, he was just shy of his 36th birthday. Yes, he hadn't been feeling well, but there was certainly no indication that he was close to dying, as far as anyone knew. And yet he had gone home and put on a kettle to make some tea and collapsed on his kitchen floor and died. And his roommate had come home a couple hours later and found him. So we all we gathered at the theater that day and not knowing what to do exactly. There was a preview scheduled for that night, and that quickly got canceled. We knew that didn't seem right to just do the show for some random audience. It seemed strange and inappropriate. But we also decided very quickly that what we couldn't do was leave the theater silent that night. So Jonathan's parents lived in Albuquerque at the time, and they were flying into the city. And what we decided we would do was invite his friends and family and anybody who cared to about him to the theater. And what we would do is we would sing through the score for them as a way to try to just pay some tribute and to not keep the theater silent. To continue the work. There was no question that what we would do also was end the work, that we would sort of just fold up our tents. We had to keep it going as much as possible for his sake, for his legacy. So his parents arrived, and I met them before the show, and that was still to this day, all these years later, I still can't quite imagine what that's like for a parent to get that particular kind of phone call and to have to make that journey and come to that theater that day. And yet they were there. And they've been a part of it ever since in the most incredible way. And we all gathered up, we decided we were just going to sing through it. We weren't going to worry about all the tech stuff. We weren't going to do costume changes. We weren't going to do light cues. We weren't going to worry about, like, in some blackout, somebody tripping and falling and hurting themselves. We were just going to, have it just simply be about the words and music. So we lined up our tables, we sat behind the tables, we started singing through the score, this incredible score that Jonathan had written. And the show, it certainly is an intense show, a dramatic show, but it also has moments of humor. And one of the crazy things about that night was that even in this room full of people who were in shock and grief and terrible sadness, all of those moments of humor also played. We got huge laughs, and looking back on it, it just seems like when part of it tells me that the show tells the truth, that when you're in a really raw state, when something terrible is happening in your life, you would only be able to laugh if something rings true. If that's what can cut through the grief. And those moments play just like they would play every night, and then there were moments like One Song Glory where Adam started singing those lyrics, One Song Before I Go, One Song to Leave Behind, that just were resonating in a million ways back on Jonathan. And by the time we got to La Vie Boheme, there was such an energy in the room. The play was really, it felt like the kind of rock concert energy, again, even in the face of this grief, that by the time we got to that number, that number in the show is about a community of people, a community of friends coming together in the face of really difficult circumstances. Some of them are dying, some of them may not be there next week. And even in the face of that, they're able to come together and celebrate